So I'm finally ready to spill about the most insane 6 months of my life. You know when you think you have everything under control, and then suddenly your whole world just implodes? Yeah, that's what happened when I told my husband I don't do 50-50, because I'm the table. I'm Sharon, 31, and I never thought I'd end up sleeping on my mom's ancient air mattress at my big age. But here we are. It all started 3 years ago at this networking mixer downtown. I was wearing my interview blazer even though I hadn't had an actual interview in months. My communications degree from state was collecting dust while I was between opportunities, as I like to call it. That's where I met Anthony. He wasn't the best-looking guy in the room, but he had this confidence about him. Not the fake kind I was putting on. He owned his own contracting business despite dropping out after sophomore year, and I could tell from his watch he was doing well for himself. Our conversation flowed easily, and when he mentioned he'd been working since he was 16 instead of going to college, I found myself saying how refreshing it was to meet someone who took an alternative path. Inside, I was thinking he'd probably be grateful to date someone with my education. We exchanged numbers, and within a week, he was taking me to dinner at places I couldn't afford on my own. After 3 months of dating, I stopped my half-hearted job search altogether. Why bother when Anthony could provide? He seemed impressed when I'd mentioned concepts from my business communications classes, and I loved watching him nodding along when I'd explain things I knew he didn't fully understand. The proposal came 9 months in. Nothing fancy, just a simple ring over dinner at home, but I said yes immediately. My mom was concerned about the rush, but I assured her Anthony was stable and hardworking. What I didn't tell her was how relieved I was to have found someone who could support me while I figured out my next career move. His mother, though, saw right through me from day one. At our first meeting, she kept asking about my career plans and looked completely unimpressed when I talked about waiting for the right opportunity. After we left, Anthony mentioned she'd pulled him aside and said I seemed more interested in his wallet than his heart. I laughed it off, calling her old-fashioned, but the comment stung because there was some truth to it. After the wedding, we moved into the house Anthony had bought before meeting me. Technically, his name was the only one on the deed due to my credit issues, but I immediately started referring to it as our home and redecorating with his credit card. I'd make these little comments at social gatherings about how Anthony was street smart but not book smart, laughing like it was just a harmless joke while he smiled uncomfortably. When we'd have dinner with his clients, I'd casually mention my college education and slip in stories about Anthony's family being salt-of-the-earth types, with a tone that clearly communicated I thought they were beneath us intellectually. Anthony worked constantly to grow his business while I managed our social calendar and home, though my version of home management mostly involved hiring cleaners when we could afford them, and leaving things undone when we couldn't. Whenever he'd bring up me finding work, I'd remind him that with my degree, I couldn't just take any job. It had to be something that reflected my education and potential. The unspoken agreement, at least in my mind, was that his role was to provide financially, while mine was to bring class and sophistication to our partnership. After all, I'd spent 4 years and thousands in student loans to get my degree, so wasn't that my contribution? I truly believed that by marrying him, I was doing Anthony a favor, elevating his social standing and bringing intellectual credibility to his life. And for a while, that delusion worked for both of us, until reality came knocking at our door, with the bill collectors right behind it. That's when things started getting tense between us. I developed a taste for nice things. After all, what was the point of having a hardworking husband if I couldn't enjoy the benefits? But I was smart about it, or so I thought. I'd hide shopping bags in the trunk before bringing them inside, snip tags off clothes, and hang them like they'd been in my closet forever. At first, Anthony didn't notice the new designer purses or the expensive candles that filled our home. But then, the credit card bills started piling up. Anthony started working longer hours, sometimes not coming home until after 10 p.m. I'd complain about being lonely, but when he was home, I'd needle him about growing the business faster. My friend Julia's husband just bought her a Range Rover, I'd mentioned casually over dinner. Maybe if you'd finished college, you'd know how to scale properly. He'd look hurt, but I'd quickly smooth it over by saying I was just helping him think bigger. Behind his back, I was checking his emails and business accounts, searching for signs that he was failing so I could prepare myself. I was terrified of losing the lifestyle I'd grown accustomed to, but refused to consider getting a job myself. Things got worse when inflation hit and everything got more expensive. When our favorite restaurant raised prices, Anthony suggested we cut back on eating out. I took it as a personal attack. Are we poor now? I snapped, knowing it would wound his pride. That night, I met my girlfriends for drinks and vented about how Anthony wasn't ambitious enough. He's just not on my intellectual level, I slurred after my third martini, unaware that Melissa was recording parts of our conversation on her phone while pretending to text. 2 days later, Anthony was suddenly cold to me, and I later found out Melissa had sent him clips of me trashing him to our friends. I tried damage control, crying and apologizing, but something had changed in him. He started asking questions about bills and expenses I couldn't answer. When he discovered I'd maxed out 3 credit cards he didn't know existed, the real fights began. He wanted full transparency about our finances, which I found controlling and insulting. Meanwhile, I was still manipulating our mutual friends, painting Anthony as a workaholic who cared more about money than our marriage. Most believed me. I'd always been better with people than he was, but a few started keeping their distance, seeing through my act. I was building a house of cards, and the winds of reality were starting to blow. Then came the night that changed everything. Anthony came home early. I later found out he'd fired a client who'd been disrespectful to his crew, something I would have criticized him for had I known. He found me online shopping for a vacation we couldn't afford. The look on his face was different. Something had hardened in him. "We need to talk about our financial situation," he said calmly. Too calmly. He laid out spreadsheets showing our debt, monthly expenses, and income, all organized in a way that surprised me. Had he always been this financially literate? "I need you to contribute," he said finally. "Get a job. Any job. We can't continue like this." I laughed, actually laughed in his face. "You want me to work at some minimum wage job with my degree? That's beneath me." The argument escalated quickly. He pointed out that my degree wasn't earning us anything sitting unused. I countered that I'd married him with certain expectations, that he would provide while I managed our social life and home. When he suggested we go 50-50 on expenses until things improved, something in me snapped. "I don't do 50-50, I yelled. "I'm the table. You don't get to come home and eat if you don't buy the groceries and set the table. That's how marriage works." The silence that followed was deafening. "What does that even mean?" he asked quietly. I couldn't really explain it. It was something I'd heard in a TikTok about women not settling for less than they deserve. But in that moment, as Anthony looked at me like I was a stranger, I doubled down rather than admit I was parroting something I didn't fully understand. "It means I bring value just by being here. My presence is my contribution. You should be working harder if we're struggling, not asking me to lower myself." He shook his head slowly and left the room. That night, he slept in the guest bedroom for the first time in our marriage. The next morning, he was gone before I woke up, and I found a note on the kitchen counter. "I've moved half our monthly expenses into the joint account. That's all I'm contributing from now on. You need to cover the rest or we need to seriously downsize." I crumpled the note and threw it away, convinced he was bluffing. He wasn't. When I tried to use his credit card for a hair appointment that weekend, it was declined. When I called him screaming, he calmly explained this was the new reality. Either I contributed financially or accepted a lifestyle adjustment. Instead of looking for work, I chose escalation. I showed up at his job site unannounced, making a scene in front of his clients and employees. I'd had a few drinks for courage, which turned out to be a huge mistake. I started ranting about how he was financially abusing me, expecting his clients to side with me, but they just looked uncomfortable, and Anthony's foreman actually escorted me to my car. Later, I learned the client had pulled Anthony aside and expressed sympathy, saying his ex-wife had similar issues. They ended up signing a bigger contract that day. My meltdown had backfired completely. When the first bill came due that Anthony wouldn't cover, I panicked. In desperation, I sold a watch his grandfather had given him, telling myself I'd buy it back later. When he discovered it missing and confronted me, I denied everything until he showed me the pawnshop receipt he'd tracked down. The look of disgust on his face broke something between us permanently. That night, he recorded our entire conversation on his phone. I saw him do it but was too angry to care. He calmly informed me that since the house was solely in his name, I had 30 days to either start contributing financially or move out. I laughed again, certain he couldn't legally evict his own wife. I was wrong. Anthony had already consulted a lawyer. He knew exactly what his rights were. When I realized he was serious, I tried different tactics: crying, seduction, guilt, but nothing worked. He'd sleep at his office some nights to avoid me. When I called his mother hoping for an ally, she told me she'd warned him about me from the beginning and was glad he was finally seeing clearly. My own friends started distancing themselves after Anthony showed them recordings of my behavior. The more desperate I became, the more people pulled away. On day 31, I came home to changed locks and 2 police officers waiting outside. All my things had been packed and placed in storage. Anthony had even paid for the first month. He wasn't there himself. He couldn't even face me. My key didn't work, and the officers explained I no longer had legal right to enter the property. I called Anthony screaming and threatening, but he simply hung up. When I called back, he'd blocked my number. I sat in my car sobbing for hours, unable to process what was happening. My perfect life had imploded, and I had nowhere to go except my mother's house. Mom took me in but wasn't as sympathetic as I'd expected. "I raised you better than this," she said after hearing Anthony's side of the story. He'd actually called her before changing the locks to make sure I'd have somewhere to go. The spare room that had once been mine was now her crafting space, filled with boxes and supplies. She cleared just enough room for an ancient air mattress, a relic from camping trips during my childhood. It leaked air throughout the night, so I'd wake up practically on the floor, a physical reminder of how far I'd fallen. The first week, I did nothing but cry and rage, checking Anthony's social media obsessively. His posts never mentioned me. It was like I'd never existed. His business seemed to be thriving. He posted about new projects and expanded services. I created fake accounts to see his private posts and was devastated to discover pictures of him at industry events, smiling with clients and employees. There was a woman in some photos, his new office manager, according to the captions. She was pretty in an understated way and had her own successful design business. The jealousy was all-consuming. Mom finally gave me an ultimatum after 2 weeks of watching me spiral. "Get a job or start paying rent," she said over breakfast. "You're too old to be acting like this." I was offended. I had a degree. I couldn't just work anywhere. But my first few job interviews were disasters. When potential employers asked about the gap in my employment history, my explanations about waiting for the right opportunity sounded hollow even to me. One interviewer actually said, "So you've been out of the workforce for 3 years because you felt most jobs were beneath your education level." The way he phrased it made me sound exactly like what I was: entitled and delusional. In desperation, I finally took a receptionist position at a small property management company. The pay was barely above minimum wage, and my coworkers were much younger, most straight out of high school. The humiliation of wearing business casual clothes I once would have donated to Goodwill, answering phones and making coffee for people without college degrees, was almost unbearable. But the first paycheck brought a strange feeling of accomplishment I hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't enough to get my own place, but it covered my phone bill and gave me spending money that didn't come from a man's wallet. Throughout this whole transition, I couldn't stop thinking about how Anthony had changed. The man who'd been so enamored with me, who'd seemed so grateful for my attention, had somehow grown a backbone. I wondered if he'd been talking to someone, a therapist maybe, or a friend who'd been divorced. He'd never stood up to me like that before. never set boundaries or held his ground. Part of me was furious at this betrayal, but another part, a part I didn't want to acknowledge, was impressed. When exactly had he started recording our conversations? How long had he been planning his exit strategy? The thought that he'd been methodically documenting my behavior while acting normal made me feel physically ill. One night, after a particularly humiliating day at work where my supervisor, who was 5 years younger than me, had to correct my filing system, I broke down and called Anthony from a friend's phone. To my surprise, he answered. "What do you want, Sharon?" His voice was flat, emotionless. I started with anger, accusing him of ruining my life, but quickly shifted to tears when that didn't work. I reminded him of our good times, how happy we'd been in the beginning. "We could try again," I suggested. "I've changed, I'm working now, see? I'm contributing." There was a long pause on the line. "Sharon," he finally said, "I spent 3 years trying to be enough for you. I'm not doing that anymore." The call ended, and with it, my last hope of an easy way out of my situation. The weeks turned into months, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, things began to change. I started taking more responsibility at work, not because I wanted to, but because I had no choice. My mother's patience had limits, and the air mattress was developing a slow leak that left me waking up on the hard floor every morning. My back ached constantly, a physical reminder of my downfall. When my supervisor offered me additional training that could lead to a promotion, I swallowed my pride and accepted. The old Sharon would have seen it as beneath her dignity, but the new Sharon needed the money. 5 months after being locked out of what I still thought of as my home, I'd saved enough for the security deposit on a tiny studio apartment. The air mattress had deflated to the point where it was basically useless, a sad metaphor for my marriage. The night before moving into my new place, I found myself typing and deleting a message to Anthony. I wanted to tell him I finally understood some of what had happened between us. Not that I was taking full blame. He could have been more patient, could have tried harder to understand my perspective. But for the first time, I could see my part in our collapse. I didn't send the message. Instead, I scrolled through my social media and saw that a mutual friend had tagged Anthony at a business award ceremony. He was receiving recognition for growing his company despite economic challenges. Beside him stood the office manager, now identified as his girlfriend. She owned her own interior design business that complemented his contracting work. They were apparently collaborating on projects. The caption mentioned she'd never been to college, but had built her company from scratch. Something about that detail stung worse than seeing them together. While packing my few belongings, I found a flash drive I didn't recognize in my makeup bag. Curious, I plugged it into my laptop and discovered dozens of audio files, recordings of arguments between Anthony and me. He must have slipped it into my things when packing my belongings. Listening to my own voice, shrill, manipulative, cruel, was like meeting a stranger. In one recording, I mocked his family's simple background. In another, I threatened to tell his clients he was struggling financially if he didn't buy me the bracelet I wanted. The woman in these recordings wasn't someone I wanted to be, yet undeniably, it was me. That night at dinner, Mom asked if I'd learned anything from the experience. I gave her the answer I thought she wanted to hear, about responsibility and partnership. But inside, what I'd really learned was that I needed to be more careful about the image I projected, more strategic about how I presented my expectations. The next night, I had a date with a divorced man in his 40s who owned a small chain of furniture stores. As I dressed for the evening, I practiced looking interested in his business stories, planned how I'd subtly communicate my value without revealing my expectations too soon. I hesitated before the mirror, noticing how different I looked from the woman who'd scoffed at Anthony's suggestion to get a job. My clothes weren't as nice, my hair wasn't as perfectly styled, but there was something else, a hardness around my eyes that hadn't been there before. Experience had taught me things, but not the lessons anyone would have hoped. I hadn't learned to be more genuine or appreciative. I'd learned to be more calculating, to hide my expectations better, to play the long game. I'd learned that men can be pushed only so far before they push back, and that next time I needed to choose someone who wouldn't record the evidence. As I locked my mother's door behind me and headed toward my date, I thought about that ridiculous air mattress, slowly deflating throughout the night. Part of me wondered if it was time to let go of my table philosophy, to accept that relationships might actually require equal contribution. But that thought quickly faded as I spotted my date's luxury sedan pulling up. The air mattress was behind me now, but the table philosophy still lived in my heart, just with better camouflage. After all, I deserved nothing less than the best, and this time, I'd be smarter about how I got it.